It was known as the trial of the century, much more so than the O.J. Simpson trial or any other trial. Exactly 100 years ago, from when I'm recording this, on July 10th through 21st, 1925, they had the Scopes monkey trial. It was both a serious legal case and also a carnival. Several people brought monkeys dressed in various costumes and chimpanzees as well to the occasion, just because of the spectacle. The Scopes trial was one of the crucial battles in North America over the freedom to teach science versus religious dogma. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, it was naturally a shocking thing for many people to realize. But by the time he died in 1882, it was widely accepted all across most of Europe and also parts of North America. Darwin and his ideas were so accepted by the British that he's buried in Scientist Corner in Westminster Abbey next to Isaac Newton. In 1859, British and European society were scandalized by the idea we were related to apes, but they soon came to terms with it. In North America, it was slightly slower, but even in the Bible Belt, people accepted the idea that evolution might have occurred. In 1880, the editor of a religious journal in America said perhaps a quarter, perhaps half educated ministers of our leading evangelical denominations believe that the story of creation and the fall of man told in Genesis is no more than a record of actual occurrences than is the parable of the prodigal son. E.C. Dixon, one of the founders of the fundamentalist movement, felt repugnant to the idea that an ape or orangutan was my ancestor, but he was willing to accept the humiliating fact if proved. Reuben Torrey, another fundamentalist Protestant, said, for purely scientific reasons, a man could believe thoroughly in the absolute infallibility of the Bible and still be an evolutionist of a certain type. So even as late as the 1880s and 1890s, fundamentalists accepted evolution to some degree, although they were not happy about the idea. They did not insist on contradicting science or saying science was wrong and the Bible was right. But in 1895, the wind shifted and the fundamentalist movement was born. It was not so much a reaction to evolution as a reaction to the higher criticism coming from Germany, which showed the origins of the Bible was not as clear-cut as they used to think, and also a reaction to the modernist movement in Protestantism, especially among Methodists and Presbyterians, which no longer accepted miracles or accepted the Bible as infallible. In 1895, they worked out the 5 fundamentals of fundamentalism: biblical inerrancy, which of course is contradicted by evolution, the virgin birth of Christ, Christ's atonement for our sins, the resurrection of Christ, and the reality of miracles. To them, the denial of miracles, the denial of Bible infallibility, denial of Christ being born of a virgin, and so on, led down the steps from agnosticism to the evil atheism, and they were not about to put up with that. They saw evolution as part of the problem, and they, of course, attacked all of its various components, but it was not the main focus of the fundamentalists initially. In their words, science, falsely so-called, denied miracles and therefore denied the fundamentals that they accepted. They also did not like the idea that educational institutions tend to lead people away from fundamentalist viewpoints. That's not an idea that's very different from now. And remember, fundamentalism is not restricted to American evangelical Protestants. Obviously, it takes place in other religions, especially now in much of the Muslim world, which is also adamantly denying evolution. Has fundamentalism gone away since the 1920s? It's still as powerful in this country as it ever was, although in very different form than it had in the 1920s, when the battles were over evolution and miracles rather than the battles we fight today over things like abortion and gay rights. But if fundamentalism was founded in 1895, why did it become so virulent in the 1920s? Remember, the period from 1900 to about 1920 was the Progressive Era, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, with major legislation about union protection, trust busting, and the income tax were passed. Women got the right to vote, and, of course, prohibition was passed as well. Another major factor was the horrors of World War I, where thousands of Americans were killed in a pointless stalemate over a few pieces of land in Belgium and France. The pointless slaughter of thousands of soldiers in trench warfare, thanks to machine guns and poison gas and tanks and so on, made lots of people sour on the idea that warfare was a noble thing. The other great shock of this period was the giant Spanish flu epidemic, which killed thousands of people, often in a single day, with no warning. It is no surprise that stress and change in the 19 teens would lead people to look for something different in the 1920 election. The Republican Party was stalemated for a very long time until the 23rd ballot in the GOP convention, when they picked an obscure senator from Ohio, Warren Gamaliel Harding, who was mostly picked because he was a stooge of the power bosses and because he looked handsome enough that they thought the women of the 1920s, voting for the first time, would vote for him based on his looks. Harding only lasted 3 years in the White House before he died unexpectedly, leaving Calvin Coolidge as president. Thanks to the scandals during his administration, most scholars of the presidency think he was one of the worst presidents we ever had. Thanks to the media, we often talk about it as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age, and indeed it was for the rich people who could afford to party, and especially those who could afford to get the illegal booze and speakeasies. But it was also a time of gangsterism and violence, and of course, most people were not rich enough to dance away the night in the speakeasies, and of course, Prohibition not only brought gangsters, but also widespread breaking of the law. So beneath this party atmosphere was actually a strong tendency for conservative backlash. This manifested in 1925 with the Butler Act, which prohibited the teaching of evolution in the state of Tennessee. Introduced by Tennessee Representative J.W. Butler, a farmer but also a fundamentalist leader, it was designed to prevent the teaching of evolution in Tennessee. Butler later stated, "I didn't know anything about evolution. I'd read in the papers that boys and girls were coming home from school and telling their fathers and mothers the Bible is all nonsense." Nevertheless, the Butler Act was passed, and the ACLU was looking for a town to be a test case to strike the law down. And of course, defending it was a very important individual as well, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was known as a great commoner, a great supporter of workers' people's rights and farmers' rights against the big businesses and banks. He had run for president 3 times, twice against William McKinley, 1896 and 1900, and once against Taft in 1908. The only person to run 3 times from the Democratic Party and lose all 3 times. But by the 1920s, Bryan was getting over 60 years old and was no longer the young firebrand who had defended workers and farmers. Instead, his viewpoints had changed thanks to World War I. He saw the German aggression in World War I and the slaughter in the trenches as a product of social Darwinism, and by the 1920s, he swung far to the right and was very much a conservative, defending the Bible against the modern world and especially evolution. Ironically, he was not a little creationist who believed in a 6-day creation. George Washington Rapelier, the owner of a local coal mine, plus the heads of the council and the head of the school district, decided to put together a test case in Robinson's drugstore over sodas at the soda fountain. None of these men were truly fundamentalists. They simply wanted to put a big spectacle there in Dayton so they could bring tons of crowds and bring lots of money to a struggling town. They recruited the local gym teacher and high school football coach, John T. Scopes, to test whether the law was constitutional and allow the case to be brought up through the courts. Scopes was willing to do this because he strongly believed in academic freedom and the right of science to be a part of this curriculum. But he only served as a biology substitute teacher for 1 day, and to this day no one knows for sure whether he actually taught evolution in that class. It didn't really matter, though, because all the schools in Tennessee were using hunter civic biology, which had a prominent role for evolution, and the classroom itself was decorated with various types of evolutionary diagrams. Scopes was in on the big fix, so much so that he urged the students to testify against him and coach them on their answers. The judge in the case, John Ralston, all but instructed the grand jury to indict Scopes despite the evidence and wanted to rush the case through so that it could be immediately appealed. Scopes was nominally arrested, but he was never detained or put in jail, and the $500 bail was put up by Baltimore Sun newspaper. Once the trial date was set, and William Jennings Bryan was scheduled to appear as a prosecuting attorney, then George Rapelier invited the novelist H.G. Wells to come in and become the defense attorney, although he was not an attorney and had no experience in American law. Eventually, they enticed Clarence Darrow, the famous defense attorney, to take on the case. Darrow was famous for taking on difficult defenses. He was also one of the founders of the ACLU. He defended Leopold and Loeb in their 1924 murder trial, and in an 8-hour jury summation got them spared from the death penalty. He also defended Ossian Sweet, a black man accused of murder for defending himself against a white mob. And so the case was set for July 10, 1925 in the Rhea County Courthouse, which still today looks pretty much like it did in 1925, with small modifications. As might be expected in the old-fashioned, stuffy old brick courthouse with no ventilation, the conditions inside the courtroom were unbearable, with hot temperatures and high humidity, and people smoking their cigars, so everyone was walking around in shirt sleeves without their ties and fanning themselves over the course of the trial. Darrow planned to put the law itself on trial, showing it not only violated science, but also violated the Constitution and the rights of teachers to teach what they must teach. He brought in expert witnesses who were scientists and also Christian men to testify that evolution did not, in fact, contradict the Bible. But Judge Ralston wanted a quick trial and a simple verdict whether or not Scopes had broken the law, so he sent all of Darrow's witnesses home unable to testify because they had been not allowed to do so. By the last day of the trial, conditions inside the courthouse were so horrible that they moved the trial to the park next door and held it outdoors. Here the trial reached its climax, when, denied of all of his regular defense witnesses, Clarence Darrow asked if Brian could be used to testify about the Bible. Overconfident and foolish, Brian allowed this to happen, at which point Darrow crucified him on the witness stand, getting him to admit all the inconsistencies and foolish things in the Bible, like where Cain and Abel got their wives, or whether a day was a day when there was no sun. Scopes himself was never allowed to testify, and at the end of the trial he said, "Your Honor, I feel that I have been convicted of violating an unjust statute. I will continue in the future, as I have in the past, to oppose this law in any way I can. Any other action would be in violation of the idea of academic freedom, that is, to teach the truth that's guaranteed in our Constitution of personal religious freedom. I think the fine is unjust." Despite appearances, Brian and Darrow were actually friends, since in their early careers they both fought hard for the rights of working men and farmers. Tragically, 5 days after the trial ended, Brian died at the age of 65, possibly from the stress of being destroyed on the witness stand. But it was truly the trial of the century, reported not only in the newspapers, but for the first time ever in history, broadcast live over radio, so the entire world could hear the proceedings as they occurred. Most of the reporting, of course, mocked the silly hillbillies of Tennessee who believed in a six-day creation. Most importantly, the famous columnist H.L. Mencken was a savage critic of the events. Among the many passages in his daily columns about the trial, Mencken wrote, "The Scopes trial from the start has been carried on in the manner exactly fitted the anti-evolution law and the simian imbecility under it. There hasn't been the slightest pretense of decorum. The rustic judge, a candidate for re-election, has postured the yokels like a clown in a 10-cent sideshow, and almost every word he has uttered has been an undisguised appeal to their prejudices and superstitions." Ralston had gotten the quick jury verdict of guilty that he had wanted, but then he made a mistake. He fined Scopes $100, which is about $1,300 in today's money, but Tennessee law says the judge could fine no more than $50, and therefore the case became a mistrial and was never available for appeal. The Tennessee monkey law and all the other laws like it around the South stayed on the books until 1967 when they finally reached the Supreme Court. What most people know about the Scopes trial comes from the play and movie Inherit the Wind, which was written in the 1950s as actually a plea against the Red Scare and red baiting of the time. It had a very fine cast in the 1961 movie version, with Spencer Tracy playing the Darrow character, Frederick March the Brian character, Harry Morgan of MASH as the judge, and Dick York of Bewitched as the Scopes character. Although the real trial had made the monkey laws an embarrassment across the country, it did have a chilling effect on the teaching of science. 100 civic biology and almost all the science textbooks at that time were censored with no mention of evolution, and science teachers across the country were afraid to talk about the topic, and many still avoid it today. But outside events intervened again. In 1957, the Americans realized that the Soviet spacecraft Sputnik was flying above their heads, and soon science curricula across the country were being updated because we'd fallen so far behind the Soviets in science. The biology curriculum was also revised with the BSCS, which brought evolution back into biology textbooks after 40 years of being censored. That brought reaction from the right wing and the fundamentalists, who introduced what they called creation science and tried to have it taught in the schools along with evolution. The leading book of that movement was Whitcomb and Morris's Genesis Flood, which claimed to explain the entire fossil record as a single flood of Noah. This attempt to put religion in science classes was, of course, met with NORA lawsuits and decided in 1982 in McLean versus Arkansas, which established that religion could not be used in a science classroom. Creationists then tried to push the balanced treatment idea of teaching creationism and evolution side by side in schools, which was struck down in the 1987 Edwards versus Aguilar case. Then they decided to be even sneakier and they took all the obvious references of God right out of the textbooks altogether. So in the early 2000s, we had a new revival of creationism. Their main book, Of Pandas and People, took out all the direct references to God, but it was clearly creationism in wolf's clothing. In 2005, Judge John Jones, a conservative judge appointed by George W. Bush, clearly showed that it was in fact the same thing and it was unconstitutional. The so-called intelligent design creationism movement has died, but the battle never stops. Their tactics just get more sneaky and underhanded. So, for example, they say, teach the controversy, as if creationism and evolution were both scientific dogmas that students could decide between. Or criticize evolution, but not creationism. Or teachers should have academic freedom to teach whatever they think is right. I've been fighting this battle since 1983, and today the National Center for Science Education in Oakland, California is a central clearinghouse for information and for cases about both creationism and now climate change, under attack from the same people. If you'd like to learn more about this, check out my book, Evolution: What the Fossils Say and Why It Matters.